So, for instance, if you have the quadratic equation x squared minus 3x minus 10 is equal to 0. First, before we solve it, I want to show you the form here. What you always expect is a x squared term of some kind, a term with x in it, some coefficient in front of x in it, and then some constant term is equal to 0. If you have any equation that can be written in this form, then you're going to be able to use the quadratic formula. Now, before we use the quadratic formula, I want to point out, because we've been using completing the square a lot, you can always solve this guy different ways. So for instance, the coefficient in front of this x is 1, the x squared. Here's the constant term. If I move the constant term to the other side, then I would just have this on the left-hand side. And then I could use completing the square to solve this equation. So you can use completing the square here. It's just that the quadratic formula makes it even easier to solve these guys without having to go through all the process of completing the square. The thing you have to know here is that the coefficient in front of the x squared term, we call it a. In this case, a is 1. The coefficient in front of the x term is called b. In this case, is -3. And the coefficient, well, there's no x's here, but the constant term that's on that side is what we call c, and that's -10. So all you have to do when you're looking at a quadratic equation is identify a, identify b, identify c, and then you get to use the quadratic formula. Now in the last lesson, we derived the quadratic formula. We actually figured out what that formula is, and we did it by completing the square. So it comes from completing the square. But now that that work has been done, you can just use the quadratic formula, and you should memorize it. And it goes like this. X is equal to -b plus or minus, and I'm going to write b squared minus 4 times a times c, and the square root goes over all of these terms. And then it's a giant fraction, and on the bottom, it's 2 times a. So that's really it. This is a plug and chug kind of formula. You stick a, b, and c in here, and then it just calculates the values of x, and it works for any quadratic equation at all. Anything of this form, x squared, x, and then a constant, you just stick the numbers in. So let's just crank through it. So the way you handle this is you say x is equal to -b. Now b is actually -3 in this case. So the formula says -b. So don't do too many things at once. Don't outsmart yourself. The way you write it is negative, and then b is -3. So this negative is just from the formula. The b is -3, so we're going to write that here. I'm not going to make this positive yet. That'll come in a later step. You don't want to do too many things at once. All right, and then after that, you want to write plus or minus, and then you have b squared minus 4ac. So b squared, again, don't do the math yet. Write it as b, this is what b is, squared, minus 4 times a, which is 1, times c, which is -10. You write everything there. Don't forget that all of this is surrounded by a square root. And then you draw your big giant fraction bar, and on the bottom, it's 2 times a, which is 1. The reason you don't do too many things at once is because you will eventually make a sign error. You will forget something, and then you get the wrong answer for no reason. So you spend this step just writing down the numbers, and then in the next step, you continue on with simplifying things. So here you have negative times negative makes this a +3. The plus or minus always stays there. And then on the inside, you're going to have -3 squared, which is +9, minus, and then here you can do some math here. 4 times 1 is 4, and then times -10 gives you -40, right? -40. So this is -40, right? But then you have this minus, so it's minus a -40. So that's basically a +40. So here you have a +40 in here. And all this stuff is a square root. Make sure you understand that. So here you have -40 from this. This makes it a +40. And then on the bottom, it's 2 times 1, which is just 2. So you see how things start to clean up pretty fast. All right, now what we're going to do is take this, and we're going to continue writing down, or simplifying here. So x is going to be equal to 3 plus or minus the square root of 9 plus 40, which is 49. Which is nice because 49 is a perfect square, so we'll be able to simplify that in the next step, over 2. So then we know that x is 3 plus or minus, what is the square root of 49? You should know that. 7 times 7 is 49 over 2. Now really, you almost could circle the answer here because this is really the answer, but this plus or minus really means that there's two answers here, and you want to drill it down as far as you can. So we want to write down both answers. So the first is, on the top, if the plus is selected, it's 3 plus 7 over 2, which is 10 over 2, which is 5. So the first answer is that x is equal to 5, just like this. And the second answer, I'll do that one in red, is x is equal to, if you select the minus sign, 3 minus 7 over 2. Now on the top, 3 minus 7 is negative 4. What's negative 4 divided by 2 is negative 2. So it's x is equal to negative 2. And that's the final answer right there. So what you see at the end of the day when you finish all this thing is that any quadratic formula, any quadratic equation, you can use this quadratic formula, which you should memorize. And when you crank through it, you're always going to get two numbers. Two answers are always going to come out because you have a plus minus in the quadratic formula. This 5, if you stick it in here, will satisfy the equation. This negative 2, if you stick it in here, will also satisfy that equation. So now that we've got the basic idea out of the way with the first problem, now we're going to crank through the remaining problems a little bit faster. 5x squared minus 11x plus 2 is equal to 0. And I just want to reiterate one more time that we're going to use the quadratic formula, but you could use completing the square if you wanted to. You don't want a 5 here if you're going to complete the square, so you divide the whole thing by 5 to get rid of this, and you take whatever constant was left and throw it over to the other side. But then at that point, we would be able to use the completing the square technique as we've done before. But in this case, we just note that a is equal to 5, b is equal to negative 11, and c is equal to 2, just the three numbers that are in this problem. And then we always write our quadratic formula, even if you've written it a million times. Plus or minus b squared minus 4 times a times c, square root goes over that, over 2a. And then we just start plugging things in. So we'll switch to black for that. So x is equal to negative b. So the negative sign comes here, but b itself is actually negative. So you put it in parentheses, negative 11, plus or minus. Then you have b squared, which is negative 11 squared minus 4 times a, but a is 5, times c is 2. Square root goes around all of these numbers. All of this floats over a fraction bar. 2 times a, but a is 5. So again, your first step, you put those numbers in. You don't try to do any multiplication or anything because you want to keep everything as clean as you can to trace your work if you make a mistake somewhere along the way. All right, so now we go down here. For the first step, negative times negative 11 gives you positive 11, plus or minus. And inside of here, negative 11 squared is going to be positive 121 minus, and here's where you can do a little bit. 4 times 5 is 20, times 2 is 40. The minus sign is still there, so it's minus 40 or negative 40. The square root wraps around there, and on the bottom, 2 times 5 is 10. All right, 2 times 5 is 10. And we have room at the bottom here to do a little bit more. We have 11 plus or minus. What is 121 minus 40? That's going to be 81. Square root wraps around that. On the bottom you have 10. So we can take this and we can continue our answer over here. We'll switch to blue. Now the nice thing about it is the square root of 81 is easy. It's 9. So basically what you have is 11 plus or minus 9 over 10. So again, you're always going to get two answers because one of these answers involves a plus sign, one of them involves a minus sign. And this plus or minus that you get here, if you go back to my lesson on deriving the quadratic formula, you'll see where that comes from. But it's always going to be present in every one of your answers here. So x, the first case, will be 11 plus 9 over 10, right? So what you have is going to be 20 over 10, which is 2. So our first answer is going to be x is equal to 2. All right, and then for our next answer, we just have to choose the other sign. 11 minus 9 over 10. What is 11 minus 9? That's going to be 2 over 10, which is a fraction, and you can reduce that to 1/5. So the other answer is going to be 1/5. All right, so you have two answers. X is equal to 2, x is equal to 1/5, and that is the final answer. So with this, we're just introducing how to use the quadratic formula. It's very easy to do, but it's also very easy to make sign errors in here. So we're going to work a few more problems in the next couple of lessons to give you practice with it. But for now, just make sure you can solve these yourself, and then follow me on to the next lesson where we will continue working with the quadratic formula in algebra.
Learn anything at mathandscience.com.